Have you ever felt like your entire existence needed to be explained, justified, and approved by people who were supposed to love you unconditionally? Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to just live your life without having to defend every single decision you make to people who seem to think they own a piece of your soul? Well, let me tell you something that might change everything you thought you knew about family, loyalty, and what it really means to be free. My name doesn't matter right now. What matters is that for 28 years of my life, I lived in a prison that didn't have bars, didn't have locks, but somehow felt more suffocating than any actual cage could ever be. This prison was built with questions, expectations, judgments, and the relentless demand that I explain myself at every turn. Why did you choose that job? Why are you dating that person? Why don't you call more often? Why are you wearing that? Why aren't you married yet? Why did you move so far away? Why? Why? Every decision, every breath, every moment of my existence felt like it needed to pass through some invisible committee of relatives who believed they had the right to dissect my choices, like I was some kind of experiment they were monitoring. I remember lying awake at night, my heart pounding with anxiety, rehearsing conversations in my head where I would have to explain why I wanted to take a different career path, why I needed space, why I couldn't attend every single family gathering, why I was choosing myself for once in my goddamn life. The weight of it all was crushing me. Slowly, methodically, like being buried alive under layers of expectation and obligation that I never actually agreed to carry. I grew up in what everyone on the outside would call a close-knit family, the kind that gets together every weekend, the kind where everyone knows everyone's business, the kind that people romanticize in movies and books. But what they don't show you in those stories is how closeness can become claustrophobia, how love can become control, how care can morph into surveillance. My family wasn't abusive in the traditional sense. They didn't hit me, they didn't scream at me, they didn't lock me in rooms or withhold food, but they did something that I think might be even more insidious because it's so much harder to identify and even harder to escape. They made me believe that I owed them pieces of myself, that my autonomy was somehow negotiable, that my right to make choices about my own life was actually a privilege they granted me, rather than a fundamental human right I was born with. Every phone call felt like an interrogation. Every family dinner felt like a performance review. Every holiday gathering felt like I was standing trial for crimes I didn't even know I had committed. The questions came from everywhere. From my mother, who wanted to know why I wasn't dating someone from our community. From my father, who couldn't understand why I didn't want to join the family business. From my aunts, who thought I was selfish for prioritizing my mental health. From my cousins, who felt personally offended when I couldn't make it to their events. From my grandparents, who acted like every choice I made that diverged from their traditional path was a direct insult to their legacy. I started noticing how much energy I was spending on these explanations, how exhausted I felt after every interaction, how I was living my life in constant defense mode, always ready with a justification, always armed with reasons that somehow never seemed good enough. I would spend hours crafting the perfect explanation for why I needed to miss a family event, knowing that no matter how valid my reason was, it would be picked apart, questioned, and ultimately dismissed as not important enough. The thing about constantly explaining yourself is that it sends a very clear message to your brain and to everyone around you, that you need permission to exist, that your choices are always up for debate, that your feelings and needs are less important than everyone else's opinions about them. I didn't realize I was doing this to myself for so long because it was all I had ever known. It was the water I was swimming in, the air I was breathing, the normal that had been established since before I could even form conscious memories. But somewhere deep inside, in a place I was afraid to look, I knew something was fundamentally wrong with this dynamic. I knew that healthy love shouldn't feel like an audit, that real family shouldn't require you to justify your existence at every turn, that true support shouldn't come with strings attached and conditions that needed to be met. The anxiety became so pervasive that I started making decisions based not on what I actually wanted, but on what would be easiest to explain, what would generate the least amount of questions, what would keep the peace even if it meant sacrificing pieces of my soul in the process. I turned down job opportunities because I didn't want to explain why I was leaving the state. I stayed in relationships longer than I should have because breaking up would require explaining what went wrong to people who had no business knowing those intimate details. I skipped therapy appointments because I couldn't bear the thought of my family finding out and demanding to know what I was working through and why I thought I needed professional help instead of just talking to them. Can you imagine living like that? Can you picture yourself filtering every single choice through the lens of how you're going to justify it to people who have somehow convinced you and themselves that your life is their business? It's exhausting in a way that's hard to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it. It's like running a marathon where the finish line keeps moving further away, where no matter how much you explain, it's never enough, where the goalposts shift constantly and you can never quite get it right. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt like you couldn't breathe because everyone wanted a piece of you and you had nothing left to give? Comment below because I want to know I'm not alone in this experience. The physical manifestations of this stress started showing up in ways I couldn't ignore anymore. I developed tension headaches that would last for days. My stomach was always in knots. I started grinding my teeth at night so severely that my dentist asked if I was going through something traumatic. I had panic attacks that would come out of nowhere, triggered by something as simple as seeing a missed call from a family member or receiving a text asking when we could talk. My body was screaming at me to stop, to change something, to save myself before this pattern of constant justification and explanation destroyed me completely. But I didn't know how to stop because stopping felt like betraying everyone I loved, like being selfish, like becoming the person they always warned me not to be. I can still remember the exact moment when I first recognized that something was deeply wrong with the way my family operated, even though it would take years before I actually did anything about it. I was 23 years old, fresh out of college, sitting in my childhood bedroom that still had posters from high school on the walls and textbooks stacked in the corner, and I was crying so hard I could barely breathe because I had just gotten off the phone with my mother. She had called to ask about my plans for the upcoming weekend, which seemed innocent enough on the surface, but I knew from experience that this wasn't really a question. It was a reconnaissance mission to gather information she could use to guide me toward the decision she had already made for me. I had been offered an amazing opportunity to attend a professional development workshop in another city, something that could really help my career, something I was genuinely excited about. But it happened to fall on the same weekend as my cousin's baby shower, an event that I had never actually been formally invited to, but was apparently expected to attend because family. When I mentioned the workshop to my mother, the silence on the other end of the phone was so heavy I could feel it pressing against my chest like a physical weight. Then came the questions, delivered in that particular tone that mothers have perfected over generations, the one that sounds concerned but is actually laced with judgment and manipulation. Why would you choose work over family? Don't you care about your cousin? What will everyone think when you're not there? Don't you know how important it is to show up for these moments? Can't you reschedule the workshop? Is this really more important than family? The questions came at me like arrows, each one finding its mark, each one designed to make me doubt myself, to make me feel guilty for even considering prioritizing my own growth and opportunities over an event that, let's be honest, I wasn't even particularly invested in. I found myself doing what I always did, scrambling to explain, to justify, to make her understand why this workshop mattered, listing all the reasons it was important for my career, explaining how rare this opportunity was, detailing the speakers who would be there and the connections I could make, trying desperately to paint a picture vivid enough that she would grant me permission to make this choice. But here's the thing about people who demand constant explanations. No explanation is ever good enough, because the explanation isn't really what they're after. What they want is control. What they want is for you to fall in line. What they want is to maintain the dynamic where they hold the power, and you remain in the position of the supplicant who must justify their existence. After 45 minutes of going in circles, explaining and re-explaining while she poked holes in every reason I gave, I finally caved. I said I wouldn't go to the workshop. I said I would attend the baby shower instead, and the relief in her voice was immediate and palpable. She praised me for making the right choice, for being a good family member, for showing that I had my priorities straight. But when I hung up the phone, instead of feeling good about making my family happy, I felt hollow, empty, like I had just sold a piece of my soul for approval that I shouldn't have needed in the first place. That's when it hit me. Sitting there in that bedroom with tears streaming down my face and my chest tight with resentment and frustration, that this wasn't normal, that healthy families don't operate like this, that love shouldn't feel like negotiation and manipulation and constant surveillance. I started thinking about my friends and their relationships with their families, how they could make choices without having to build elaborate cases to defend them, how they could say no to family events without being made to feel like terrible people, how they could live their lives without this constant weight of explanation and justification. I thought about my college roommate who once casually mentioned she wasn't going home for Thanksgiving because she wanted to go on a trip with friends. And when I asked her how her parents reacted, she looked at me confused and said they were fine with it because she's an adult and can make her own choices, a concept so foreign to me at the time that I almost couldn't comprehend it. Growing up, I had been conditioned to believe that family came before everything, that individual desires were selfish, that questioning the family dynamic was betrayal, that setting boundaries was the same as not caring, that if you really loved your family, you would always put them first, always be available, always explain yourself until they were satisfied, always seek their approval before making major life decisions. This conditioning ran so deep that even recognizing it as problematic felt like I was doing something wrong, like I was being ungrateful for a family that loved me and cared about me, even though this version of love and care was slowly destroying my sense of self and autonomy. I started paying more attention to the patterns, documenting them in a journal that I kept hidden because God forbid anyone in my family found it and demanded an explanation for why I was writing about them. I noticed how my father would ask detailed questions about my finances, not because he was offering help, but because he wanted to monitor whether I was making choices he approved of. And if I hesitated to share specific numbers, he would get offended and say things like, "We're family. We don't keep secrets from each other," as if privacy and secrets were the same thing, as if I didn't have a right to keep certain aspects of my life to myself. I noticed how my aunts would corner me at family gatherings and pepper me with questions about my dating life, my career trajectory, my plans for the future. And if I gave vague answers or tried to redirect the conversation, they would exchange glances with each other like I was being difficult or hiding something terrible, when in reality I just wanted to eat my dinner in peace without feeling like I was being interviewed for a position I never applied for. I noticed how my siblings, who were also trapped in this same system, had learned to either completely conform, living lives that looked exactly like what our parents wanted, or rebel so hard that they were considered the black sheep of the family, with seemingly no middle ground where you could be yourself while still maintaining relationships with people you loved. The weight of being the golden child, the one who always tried to explain, the one who always sought approval, the one who bent over backwards to keep everyone happy, was crushing me. And I realized that I was enabling this dynamic by participating in it, by continuing to offer explanations when I didn't owe anyone any, by treating my life like it was a group project instead of my own personal journey. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon in March, a day that started like any other but ended with me completely dismantling the person I had been for nearly 3 decades. I had been planning to move to a different city for months, a move that made perfect sense for my career, my mental health, and my future. But I had been dreading telling my family, because I knew what was coming. I knew they would demand explanations. I knew they would try to talk me out of it. I knew they would make me feel guilty for choosing myself over proximity to them. I had rehearsed what I would say probably 100 times. I had prepared answers to every question I could anticipate. I had built an airtight case for why this move was necessary. I had armed myself with facts and figures and logical arguments like I was preparing for a court case rather than simply informing my family of a decision that was already made. I called a family meeting, which in retrospect was probably my first mistake because it gave the situation more weight than it needed. It created an opportunity for group interrogation rather than individual conversations. But I thought maybe if I explained everything all at once, I could avoid having to justify myself repeatedly to different family members. I sat at my parents' dining room table, the same table where I had eaten thousands of meals, done homework, celebrated holidays, and had countless conversations over the years, and I told them about the move. The reaction was immediate and exactly what I had feared. My mother's face crumpled like I had just told her I was dying. My father's expression turned hard and cold. My siblings looked uncomfortable, and my grandmother actually started crying, saying something about how I was abandoning the family and breaking her heart in her final years, which was particularly manipulative considering she's only 72 and in perfect health. Before I could even finish explaining my reasons, the questions started flying, questions I had anticipated and prepared for, questions about why I couldn't find a similar job locally, about what was wrong with living near family, about whether I had really thought this through, about what would happen if I got sick or needed help, about how often I would visit, about whether this was because of something they had done. I launched into my explanations, delivering the well-rehearsed justifications I had prepared, talking about career growth and opportunities and new experiences and personal development, trying to make them understand that this wasn't about them, it was about me and what I needed for my life. But as I talked, watching their faces, seeing the disapproval and hurt and anger despite all my careful explanations, something inside me just snapped, like a rubber band that had been stretched too far for too long finally breaking, and I realized with sudden clarity that it didn't matter what I said, it didn't matter how perfectly I explained myself, it didn't matter how many valid reasons I provided, because this wasn't really about understanding. This was about control. This was about making me feel bad enough that I would change my decision to keep them comfortable. In that moment, something fundamental shifted in my consciousness. I felt this surge of anger and frustration and liberation all mixed together, and I heard myself say something I had never said before. I don't owe you an explanation. I'm an adult, and this is my decision, and I'm moving at the end of the month whether you approve or not. The silence that followed was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop in that dining room. Everyone was staring at me like I had just spoken in a foreign language or announced I was joining a cult. My mother was the first to recover, her shock quickly transforming into offense, asking me how dare I speak to them like that after everything they'd done for me, as if raising me and providing for me as a child meant I owed them control over my adult life forever. My father demanded I explain what had gotten into me, ironically asking for an explanation about why I wasn't giving explanations anymore, completely missing the irony in his question. I stood up from that table, my legs shaking but my resolve firm, and I said something that I had needed to say for years. I love you all, but I'm done explaining myself. I'm done seeking your approval for decisions that are mine to make. I'm done living my life like it's a democracy where everyone gets a vote. From now on, I'm going to inform you of my choices if I choose to, but I'm not going to justify them or debate them or change them based on your reactions. Then I left, walked out of that house while my mother called after me, and my grandmother wept, and my siblings sat there in shocked silence. And I got in my car and drove home with my hands trembling on the steering wheel, and my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst through my chest, feeling simultaneously terrified and more alive than I had felt in years. The aftermath of that dinner was brutal in ways I hadn't fully anticipated, even though I knew there would be consequences to standing up for myself and refusing to continue playing the game of constant justification. My phone started ringing before I even got home. Calls from my mother, my father, my siblings, my aunts, my cousins, everyone who had heard about my outburst and had opinions about it, everyone who wanted to weigh in on what I had done and how inappropriate it was, and how I needed to apologize and explain myself, which was ironic given that I had just declared I was done explaining myself. I didn't answer the calls. I let them go to voicemail, and I listened to message after message of people expressing their disappointment, their confusion, their hurt feelings, their concern that something was wrong with me, their theories about what had caused this sudden change in my behavior, their demands that I call them back immediately to discuss this situation. The messages ranged from my mother's tearful pleas asking what she had done wrong and begging me to talk to her, to my father's stern warnings that I was making a huge mistake and damaging relationships I would regret losing, to my grandmother's guilt trips about her age and her failing health and how she might not be around much longer. So how could I do this to her now? To my aunt's unsolicited advice about how I was being selfish and immature and needed to remember that family is forever. The text messages were even worse in some ways because they kept coming constantly, piling up on my phone, creating this sense of siege that made me feel like I was under attack from all sides. Messages demanding explanations for my behavior, messages asking if I was having a mental health crisis, messages suggesting I was under the influence of bad friends or a toxic relationship that was turning me against my family, messages trying to make me feel guilty by reminding me of all the things they had done for me over the years, as if love and support were supposed to be transactional, as if they were investments that entitled the investor to control over my life forever. I spent the first few days after that dinner in a state of intense anxiety and guilt, second-guessing myself constantly, wondering if I had overreacted, questioning whether I was being unreasonable, feeling the weight of all that conditioning that told me I was a bad person for setting boundaries, that I was selfish for prioritizing my own needs, that I was wrong for refusing to continue explaining and justifying my existence to people who claimed to love me. The guilt was overwhelming at times. It would wash over me in waves that left me breathless and questioning everything, because they had raised me to believe that feeling guilty meant you had done something wrong, and if you had done something wrong, you needed to apologize and fix it and go back to how things were before. But underneath that guilt, there was something else, something I was almost afraid to acknowledge because it felt wrong to feel it. There was relief. There was this sense of lightness. There was this small voice inside me that kept whispering that I had done the right thing, that I had finally stood up for myself, that I had taken the first step toward freedom even though it was terrifying and painful and lonely. I started seeing a therapist during this time, something I had wanted to do for years but had avoided partly because of the stigma my family attached to therapy, and partly because I knew they would demand to know what I was discussing in my sessions. But now I didn't care about their opinions on my mental health care because I was learning slowly and painfully that I didn't need their approval to take care of myself. My therapist helped me understand that what I was experiencing was a trauma response to breaking a dysfunctional pattern, that the anxiety and guilt I felt were actually normal reactions when you start setting boundaries in relationships that have never had healthy boundaries before, that the people in my life who were reacting with anger and hurt were reacting to the loss of control rather than to any actual harm I had done to them. She introduced me to concepts like enmeshment, emotional manipulation, conditional love, and parentification. And as she explained these terms and I saw my entire family dynamic reflected back at me through this new lens, I felt this strange mix of validation and grief. Validation because someone was finally confirming that my feelings were legitimate and that the way I had been treated wasn't normal or healthy. And grief because I was mourning the family I thought I had, the family I had wanted to believe existed, the unconditionally loving and supportive family that turned out to be more fantasy than reality. Have you ever had a moment where you realized that something you thought was normal was actually deeply dysfunctional? Share your experience in the comments below, because understanding we're not alone in this is so important. The first time I maintained a boundary without explaining myself felt like jumping off a cliff. My heart was in my throat. My palms were sweating. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to backtrack and apologize and explain and make everything okay again. But I forced myself to sit with the discomfort and not give in to the pressure. It was 3 weeks after the dinner table confrontation, and my mother had called to ask if I would come to a family barbecue the following weekend. An event I genuinely didn't want to attend because I knew it would just be an opportunity for everyone to corner me and demand explanations and try to convince me not to move and make me feel guilty for the choices I was making. In the past, I would have either forced myself to go despite not wanting to, or I would have spent hours explaining why I couldn't make it, providing a detailed breakdown of my schedule and commitments and reasons that were valid enough to justify my absence in a way that wouldn't offend anyone. But this time, I took a deep breath and I said simply, "I'm not going to be able to make it. Thanks for the invitation, though." And then I waited for the inevitable follow-up questions with my stomach in knots. My mother immediately asked why. What was I doing that was more important than family? Couldn't I rearrange my schedule? Didn't I want to see everyone before I moved away? Wasn't I even going to explain why I couldn't come? I felt the old patterns trying to assert themselves, felt my mouth opening to launch into explanations, felt the guilt rising up inside me like a wave, but I stopped myself. I literally bit my tongue to prevent the explanations from spilling out, and I said something that felt revolutionary even though it was so simple. "I have other plans that day. I hope everyone has a great time. I'll talk to you later." And then before she could respond, before she could apply more pressure, before I could cave to the guilt, I ended the call. I sat there on my couch afterward, shaking like a leaf, feeling like I had just done something terrible, feeling the guilt wash over me in waves that made me nauseous, replaying the conversation in my head and questioning whether I had been too harsh, too cold, too inconsiderate. My phone rang again almost immediately, my mother calling back, probably shocked that I had hung up, probably ready to demand a better explanation, probably prepared to guilt me into changing my mind, and I stared at that ringing phone for a long moment before I made a choice that old me never would have made. I didn't answer. I let it go to voicemail. I chose my own peace over her need for control. The voicemail she left was exactly what I expected, hurt and confused and accusatory, asking what was wrong with me, saying she didn't understand why I was being like this, reminding me that she was my mother and deserved better treatment, demanding I call her back so we could talk about this properly. But I didn't call back. Not that day. Not that week. I gave myself space to breathe and to process, and to sit with the discomfort of having disappointed someone without rushing to fix it. Something interesting happened during that week of space. I started to notice how much mental energy I had been expending on managing other people's emotions, on anticipating their reactions, on crafting explanations that would satisfy them, on walking on eggshells to avoid conflict. And now that I wasn't doing that anymore, I had all this energy available for other things, for my own thoughts and feelings, for my own interests and goals, for actually living my life instead of just defending it. I also started to notice who in my family was respecting my boundaries and who was escalating their attempts to break them down. My younger sister sent me a text saying she didn't fully understand what was going on, but she supported me and hoped I was okay, which meant more to me than she probably realized. While my older brother called to lecture me about family obligations and how I was hurting our parents and needed to get over myself and apologize. The divide was becoming clear. There were people in my family who could adapt to this new dynamic where I was an autonomous adult with rights to privacy and self-determination, And there were people who saw my boundaries as personal attacks that needed to be dismantled. I started implementing my new approach consistently. When my aunt texted asking invasive questions about my love life, I responded with a simple, "I'm not discussing that," instead of the long explanations I used to provide about why I wasn't ready to date or why I had broken up with someone or why I was choosing to focus on myself. When my father called demanding to know details about my new job and apartment in the city I was moving to, I shared basic information, but refused to justify my choices or engage with his criticisms, saying simply, "I appreciate your concern, but this is what I'm doing," when he tried to argue and convince me to reconsider. When my grandmother sent me a long email about how disappointed she was in me and how I was throwing away everything the family stood for, I read it, acknowledged the emotions behind it, and chose not to respond with the defensive explanations I would have written in the past, instead sending a brief reply that said, "I understand you're upset and I'm sorry you're hurting, but I'm moving forward with my plans." Each time I held a boundary without explaining myself to death, it got a little bit easier. The guilt lessened slightly, the anxiety decreased incrementally, the sense of empowerment grew stronger, and I started to feel like maybe, just maybe, I could actually do this. I could actually live my life on my own terms, without being held hostage by other people's need to understand and approve of every choice I made. The hardest part of this whole journey wasn't actually the initial confrontation, or even the boundary setting that followed. It was watching relationships that I valued and cared about deteriorate, because the other people in those relationships couldn't or wouldn't accept the new dynamic I was creating. I had hoped, naively perhaps, that once my family adjusted to the fact that I wasn't going to explain myself anymore, we could find a new equilibrium where we could still have loving relationships but with healthier boundaries and mutual respect for each other's autonomy. But what I learned painfully and gradually is that some relationships are built entirely on dysfunctional dynamics. And when you remove those dynamics, there's nothing left to hold the relationship together. The foundation was never actually love or genuine connection. It was control and enmeshment and codependency masquerading as closeness. My mother was probably the most difficult relationship to navigate during this transition, because part of me still craved her approval, even as I was actively working to not need it anymore. Part of me still wanted her to be proud of me and to understand me and to support my choices, even when they weren't the choices she would have made for me. We went through several painful months of minimal contact where every conversation felt strained and awkward, where I could hear the hurt and confusion in her voice, where she would make passive-aggressive comments about how different I had become, how she felt like she didn't know me anymore, how she missed the daughter I used to be, which hurt because what she was really saying was that she missed the daughter who always did what she was told, who always sought approval, who always put everyone else's needs before her own. I tried to explain to her, in moments of weakness when I fell back into old patterns, that I hadn't stopped loving her. I had just stopped letting her control me, that setting boundaries wasn't rejection. It was actually a sign of a healthier relationship where we could interact as two adults who respected each other, rather than as parent and child where one person held all the power. But she couldn't hear it. She took every boundary as a personal attack. She interpreted my refusal to explain myself as evidence that I didn't value her opinion or care about her feelings. She saw my move toward independence as abandonment rather than natural growth. The breaking point in our relationship came about 6 months into my new life in the new city, when she showed up unannounced at my apartment, having driven 3 hours without telling me she was coming, expecting me to drop everything and spend the weekend with her because she had made this grand gesture of coming to visit. When I opened my door and saw her standing there with an overnight bag and a smile that was equal parts hopeful and manipulative, I felt my stomach drop because I knew what was happening. This was a test. This was her way of seeing if I would enforce my boundaries even when it was hard, even when she was standing right in front of me, even when saying no would make me the bad guy in the story she would tell everyone back home. I took a deep breath, and I told her that I appreciated her wanting to see me, but I had plans that weekend, and I needed advance notice for visits, that she couldn't just show up and expect me to rearrange my life, that if she wanted to visit in the future, she needed to call first and we needed to plan it together. The look on her face was devastating, hurt and anger and disbelief all mixed together, and she said things that I knew were designed to make me cave, asking if I really cared so little about her, that I would turn her away after she had driven all this way, reminding me that she was my mother, and mothers should be welcome in their children's homes anytime, suggesting that there must be something I was hiding if I didn't want her there. Every word was a hook trying to catch me and pull me back into the old patterns, trying to make me feel guilty enough to abandon my boundary, trying to activate all those old buttons she had installed in me over the years. But I held firm. I offered to take her to dinner that evening so we could spend a few hours together, and I suggested some weekends the following month when she could plan a proper visit. But I didn't let her stay. I didn't rearrange my plans. I didn't abandon my boundary even though it killed me to see her hurt and to know that I was the one causing that hurt. She left angry, didn't even take me up on the dinner offer, drove the 3 hours back home, and then didn't speak to me for 2 months, which was its own form of punishment, its own way of trying to make me regret my choice. Its own manipulation tactic that said, if you don't do what I want, I will withdraw my love and attention until you comply. Those 2 months were lonely and painful. I questioned myself constantly, wondered if I was being too harsh, worried that I was damaging our relationship beyond repair. But I also noticed something interesting. I was living my life without that constant background noise of anxiety about what she thought, without that pressure to report and explain and justify, without that weight of managing her emotions and expectations. And as hard as it was, there was also freedom in it. Freedom I had never experienced before. During the months of limited contact with my mother and strained relationships with other family members, I started discovering parts of myself that had been buried under layers of people-pleasing and explanation-giving for so long that I had forgotten they existed. I remember the first Saturday morning I woke up in my new apartment and realized I had absolutely nothing planned and no one to answer to. No family obligations, no phone calls I needed to make, no explanations I needed to prepare for choices I was making. Just a completely open day that belonged entirely to me. I laid in bed for an extra hour just because I could. Then I got up and made myself an elaborate breakfast while listening to music my family would have considered too loud. And I spent the afternoon reading a book in a park without checking my phone every 5 minutes to see if someone needed something from me. It sounds so simple, almost mundane, but it felt revolutionary because for the first time in my adult life, I was experiencing what it meant to just exist, without constantly monitoring how my existence would be perceived and judged by others. I started trying things I had always wanted to try, but had never done, because I knew I would have to explain them to my family and defend my choices. I took a pottery class even though I had no natural talent for it. I went on a solo camping trip even though my family thought it was dangerous for a woman to travel alone. I dyed my hair a color I had always wanted but knew my grandmother would hate. I bought furniture that I loved instead of furniture that would impress visitors. I ate dinner at 9 p.m. or skipped it altogether without anyone commenting on my choices. These small acts of autonomy might seem insignificant to someone who grew up with healthy boundaries and supportive family dynamics, but for me, each one was a tiny rebellion, a declaration of independence, a step toward becoming whoever I was meant to be before I learned to shape myself around other people's expectations. I also started building new relationships with people who didn't know the old version of me. People who only knew this version that set boundaries and didn't over-explain. And it was fascinating to see how different those relationships felt from the ones I had with my family. When I told new friends I couldn't make it to an event, they said, "Okay, hope to see you next time," without demanding reasons or making me feel guilty. When I shared that I was thinking about changing careers, they asked supportive questions about what I was interested in without trying to talk me out of it or questioning my judgment. When I set a boundary about something I wasn't comfortable with, they respected it without making it into a big, dramatic issue that required hours of discussion and justification. I started to understand that the way my family had treated me wasn't normal, wasn't how healthy relationships functioned, wasn't something I needed to accept just because we shared DNA. I also started therapy more consistently, diving deeper into the patterns that had been established in childhood, understanding how being the peacekeeper and the explainer had been roles assigned to me before I was old enough to consent to them, working through the guilt and shame that came up every time I prioritized my own needs over someone else's demands. My therapist helped me see that I had been trained from a very young age to believe that my worth was tied to how well I met other people's expectations, that love in my family was conditional on compliance, that connection required sacrificing autonomy, and that these beliefs, while deeply ingrained, weren't actually true and could be challenged and changed. The process of unlearning these patterns was exhausting and painful. There were days when I wanted to give up and go back to the old ways because at least then I knew what to expect. At least then I had a script to follow. At least then I felt like I belonged somewhere, even if that belonging came at the cost of my authentic self. But I kept going, kept showing up for myself, kept holding my boundaries even when it was hard, kept choosing freedom over approval. And slowly, gradually, something started to shift inside me. The constant anxiety that had been my companion for so long began to quiet down. The guilt that used to overwhelm me started to feel more manageable. The fear of disappointing people lost some of its power over me, and I began to experience something I hadn't felt in years, maybe ever. I began to feel at peace with myself, at home in my own skin, comfortable with my choices even when other people didn't understand or approve of them. Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping yourself? Tell me about it in the comments because these stories matter and they help others feel less alone. About a year into my new life, something unexpected happened that really tested everything I had learned about boundaries and not explaining myself. My father had a minor health scare that required a brief hospital stay, and my family immediately expected me to drop everything and come home to be there for him. I got the call from my brother at 7 in the morning, his voice tight with stress as he told me Dad had chest pains and was in the emergency room. They were running tests, and I needed to get home as soon as possible because the whole family was gathering at the hospital. My immediate instinct, the pattern that had been ingrained in me for decades, was to start searching for flights, to rearrange my work schedule, to prepare explanations for my boss about why I needed emergency time off, to pack a bag and figure out how to get home within hours. But I stopped myself, took a breath, and asked my brother for more information. What exactly was happening? What did the doctors say? Was Dad's life in danger? What was the actual situation beyond the panic and drama that my family tended to create around any crisis? My brother admitted that the doctors weren't too worried, that they thought it was likely stress-related or maybe acid reflux, that Dad was stable and talking and in no immediate danger, that they were keeping him for observation but expected him to be released the next day. I felt the relief wash over me, grateful that my father was okay. But I also felt something else. I felt manipulated, because this call wasn't really about giving me information. It was about creating urgency and pressure to get me to come running back to prove I cared, to fall back into old patterns, to prioritize family drama over my own life and boundaries. I told my brother I was glad Dad was okay, to please keep me updated if anything changed or if the situation became more serious, and that I would call Dad later that day to check on him directly. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy, and then my brother said what I had known was coming. "You're not coming home. Our dad is in the hospital, and you're not coming home. What the hell is wrong with you? How can you be so selfish and cold?" I felt the familiar guilt trying to take hold. Felt the old voices in my head saying I was a terrible daughter, a terrible person, that I should drop everything and go home because that's what family does. But I also recognized this for what it was: emotional manipulation, an attempt to use my father's health scare as leverage to pull me back into the dysfunctional dynamic I had worked so hard to escape. I explained to my brother, calmly and clearly, that I cared about Dad and was glad he was stable, that I would be calling him directly, and that if the situation became serious or if Dad specifically asked for me to be there, I would reconsider, but that I wasn't going to drop everything and drive 3 hours for what sounded like a minor health issue that would be resolved quickly. My brother was furious, called me selfish, said I had changed and not for the better, hung up on me before I could respond, and I sat there with the phone in my hand feeling that familiar cocktail of guilt and grief and anger and liberation all mixed together. The rest of that day was a barrage of messages from different family members, all saying variations of the same thing. How could I not be there? What kind of daughter doesn't show up when her father is in the hospital? They couldn't believe how cold and distant I had become. Clearly, moving away had changed me and not in a good way. I was going to regret this when it was too late. My mother called me sobbing, saying she didn't know what she had done to make me hate the family so much, asking why I was punishing them, begging me to just come home and be part of the family again. Each message was designed to activate guilt and shame. Each one was trying to find the crack in my armor where they could insert doubt and make me question my decision. Each one was attempting to reestablish the old dynamic where my choices were subject to their approval and their emotional manipulation could override my own judgment. But here's what they didn't understand. What they couldn't understand because they had never tried to understand. I wasn't punishing them. I wasn't being cold or distant. I wasn't choosing not to care. I was choosing to have a proportional response to the actual situation, rather than getting swept up in the drama and panic that my family seemed to thrive on. I called my father that evening, talked to him directly, confirmed that he was fine and being released the next morning, told him I loved him and was glad he was okay, and asked if there was anything he needed from me. He admitted, somewhat sheepishly, that he was fine and the whole thing had been blown out of proportion, that he had told everyone not to make a big deal of it, but they had anyway. And while I could hear the undertone of disappointment that I hadn't rushed home, there was also something that sounded like respect. Like maybe on some level he understood what I was doing even if he didn't agree with it. That health scare became a turning point in many ways, because it clarified for me and for my family that I wasn't going to be manipulated through crisis or guilt anymore, that I was going to assess situations rationally and make my own decisions about how to respond, that my boundaries weren't going to crumble the first time they were tested with something emotional and serious. In the weeks that followed, some family members doubled down on their efforts to break me down, sending more messages about how disappointed they were, how I had become someone they didn't recognize, how my choices were hurting everyone. But others, surprisingly, started to adjust, started to accept that this was the new reality, started to interact with me in ways that were less demanding and more respectful of my autonomy. The transformation in my relationship with my younger sister was probably the most beautiful, unexpected gift of this whole painful process of establishing boundaries and refusing to constantly explain myself. She called me about 2 months after the hospital incident, and instead of the lecture or guilt trip I had come to expect from family phone calls, she said something that took me completely by surprise. She said she had been watching what I was doing, watching how I had set boundaries and stuck to them even when everyone was pressuring me to fall back in line. And she wanted to know how I did it, because she was exhausted too. She was tired of explaining herself, tired of living her life, according to everyone else's expectations, tired of being suffocated by the same family dynamics that had nearly destroyed me. We talked for 3 hours that night, and for the first time maybe ever, I felt like I had an ally in my family, someone who understood what I had been going through, someone who saw the dysfunction for what it was instead of defending it or denying it. She told me things she had never shared before, about how she had stayed in a relationship that made her miserable for 2 extra years because she couldn't bear the thought of explaining a breakup to the family, about how she had turned down a job opportunity abroad because she knew everyone would guilt her about leaving, about how she had panic attacks before family gatherings because she knew she would be interrogated about every aspect of her life. As I listened to her describe experiences that were so similar to my own, I felt this deep sadness that she had been suffering in silence. But I also felt hope because maybe my journey toward freedom could help her find her own path. Maybe by breaking the cycle for myself, I had inadvertently shown her that it was possible to break it too. I shared with her what I had learned in therapy, the books I had read about enmeshment and emotional boundaries, the strategies I had developed for staying firm when people tried to manipulate me with guilt, the mantras I repeated to myself when I felt like I was being selfish or cruel for prioritizing my own needs. I told her that it wasn't easy, that there had been days when I questioned everything, days when the loneliness of standing alone felt unbearable, days when I wanted to just give in and go back to being the person everyone wanted me to be, because at least then I felt like I belonged somewhere. But I also told her about the freedom I had found, the peace that came from not constantly monitoring and explaining and justifying my existence, the joy of discovering who I actually was beneath all the layers of conditioning and people-pleasing. The relief of waking up and not feeling that immediate anxiety about who might be upset with me or what I might need to explain today. She started implementing her own boundaries after that conversation, small at first, saying no to family events without providing elaborate explanations, declining to answer invasive questions about her personal life, making choices based on what she wanted rather than what would be easiest to justify to the family. And of course, she faced the same backlash I had faced. The same guilt trips and accusations of being selfish, and claims that she had changed for the worse. But this time she wasn't alone in it. We supported each other, shared stories about the ridiculous things family members said to try to manipulate us, reminded each other why we were doing this when the guilt felt overwhelming, celebrated small victories when we successfully held a boundary without caving. The family noticed that there were now 2 of us refusing to play by the old rules, and I could sense their frustration and confusion, because the tactics that had always worked before weren't working anymore. The guilt trips were losing their power. The manipulation was being recognized and called out. The demand for constant explanations was being met with polite refusal. My mother tried to drive a wedge between my sister and me, suggesting to each of us separately that the other one was a bad influence, that I had poisoned my sister against the family, that my sister was being manipulated by me into abandoning her values. But we compared notes and saw right through it, recognized it as the divide and conquer strategy it was, and it only made us closer and more committed to supporting each other. Over time, my brother and a couple of cousins also started asking questions, not quite ready to make the same dramatic changes my sister and I had made, but curious about how we had found the courage to set boundaries, how we dealt with the guilt, how we maintained relationships with family members while also maintaining our autonomy. I realized that by simply living my life differently, by refusing to continue participating in dysfunctional patterns, I had inadvertently given permission to other people in my family to question those patterns too, to imagine different ways of relating to each other, to consider that maybe love didn't have to feel like surveillance and connection didn't have to require sacrificing yourself. Now, almost 3 years since that dinner table confrontation that changed everything, I can say with complete honesty that stopping the constant explanations and justifications was the best decision I ever made for my mental health and my overall well-being. My relationship with my family looks completely different than it did before. Some relationships have actually ended because they couldn't survive without the dysfunction that had been holding them together. Some have become distant and superficial, polite but lacking real intimacy. And some, surprisingly, have actually become healthier and more genuine than they ever were, when I was constantly seeking approval and explaining myself. My mother and I have reached a sort of détente. We talk once every week or two. The conversations are shorter and less emotionally charged than they used to be. We stick to safer topics most of the time. And while there's a sadness in what we lost, there's also a peace in what we've built. A relationship that has boundaries and respect, even if it doesn't have the false closeness that was really enmeshment. She still sometimes tries to ask questions that cross my boundaries, still sometimes makes passive-aggressive comments about my choices, still sometimes expresses disappointment that I'm not the daughter she expected me to be. But the difference now is that I don't take responsibility for her disappointment. I don't rush to explain or justify or make her feel better about my choices. I simply acknowledge her feelings and move on. And over time, these attempts have become less frequent because she's learning that they don't work anymore. My father and I have actually developed a better relationship in some ways, because once I stopped trying to get his approval and stopped explaining every decision to him, we were able to connect on other levels, to talk about books and current events and shared interests without everything being filtered through his judgment of my life choices. He told me recently, in a rare moment of vulnerability, that watching me stand up for myself had made him respect me more, even though it had been hard for him to accept at first. And while I appreciated hearing that, I also knew that I couldn't have waited for his respect or approval before making the changes I needed to make, that the respect and approval had to come from myself first. The most profound change has been in my relationship with myself. I like who I am now in a way I never did when I was constantly contorting myself to fit into everyone else's expectations. I trust my own judgment instead of always second-guessing myself and seeking external validation. I make choices based on what feels right for me, rather than what will be easiest to explain. And I experience a kind of peace that I didn't even know was possible when I was living in constant defense mode. I've learned that not everyone is entitled to an explanation, that no is a complete sentence, that you can love people and still maintain boundaries with them, that sometimes the healthiest thing you can do for a relationship is to step back from it, that your worth is not determined by how well you meet other people's expectations, that freedom sometimes costs relationships, but it's worth the price, and that the people who truly love you will love you more when you're living authentically then, when you're performing a version of yourself designed to keep them comfortable. I've also learned that this journey is ongoing. It's not like I set boundaries once and everything was fixed. It's a constant practice of checking in with myself, of noticing when old patterns try to reassert themselves, of reminding myself that I don't owe anyone explanations for how I choose to live my life, of choosing myself over and over again, even when it's hard. There are still moments when the guilt creeps in, when I wonder if I'm being too harsh or too rigid, when I feel the pull to go back to explaining and justifying because it would make everything easier in the short term. But then I remember how suffocated I felt before, how exhausted I was from constantly defending my existence, how much energy I wasted on managing other people's emotions and expectations, and I know I can never go back to that way of living. The freedom I've found in refusing to constantly explain myself has allowed me to pursue dreams I had buried, to explore parts of myself that I had hidden, to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation, to experience life as something I'm actively living rather than something I'm constantly defending. I've traveled to places I always wanted to go without having to justify the expense or the timing. I've changed careers to something that actually fulfills me instead of staying in a job that looked good to my family. I've ended relationships that weren't serving me without having to explain every detail of what went wrong. I've started hobbies that bring me joy, even though no one in my family understands why I like them. I've made choices that are right for me, even when they don't make sense to anyone else. And I've done all of this without the crushing weight of needing everyone's approval and understanding. If you're reading this or watching this and you recognize yourself in my story, if you've been living your life in constant explanation mode, if you feel exhausted from trying to justify your existence to people who seem to think they own pieces of you, I want you to know that you're not crazy, you're not being too sensitive, you're not imagining the dysfunction, and you deserve to live your life without having to defend every choice you make. It's going to be hard to start setting boundaries. The guilt is going to be overwhelming at times. People are going to accuse you of being selfish or cold or ungrateful. You're going to question yourself constantly, and some relationships might not survive the transition, but on the other side of that pain is a freedom that's worth fighting for, a peace that comes from living authentically, a joy that comes from discovering who you are when you're not constantly shaping yourself around other people's expectations. You are allowed to make choices without explaining them. You are allowed to set boundaries without justifying them. You are allowed to prioritize your own well-being without feeling guilty about it. You are allowed to disappoint people in service of being true to yourself. And you are allowed to build a life that makes sense to you even if it doesn't make sense to anyone else. The people who truly love you will adjust to your boundaries and will love the authentic version of you even more than they loved the version that was always seeking approval. And the people who can't accept your boundaries and your autonomy were probably never really loving you in a healthy way to begin with. They were loving the control they had over you, the power they had to influence your choices, the version of you that prioritized their comfort over your own well-being. So if you're at that crossroads, if you're wondering whether you should keep explaining yourself or whether you should finally draw that line in the sand and say enough, I'm here to tell you that choosing yourself is not selfish. It's necessary. It's healthy. It's the beginning of actually living instead of just surviving. What's your experience with family expectations and boundaries? Have you ever felt like you had to constantly explain and justify yourself to people who were supposed to love you unconditionally? Share your story in the comments below because your experience matters and it might help someone else feel less alone in this struggle. If this story resonated with you, if you felt seen or understood or validated in any way, please leave a like on this video because it helps other people who need to hear this message find it. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about living through difficult experiences and coming out stronger on the other side, subscribe to Living Through It and hit that notification bell so you never miss when I share the next chapter of this journey. Remember, you don't owe anyone an explanation for choosing yourself, for setting boundaries, for living your life in a way that honors who you actually are rather than who everyone else thinks you should be. Your life belongs to you, not to the people who think their opinions and expectations should dictate your choices. And the sooner you embrace that truth, the sooner you can start experiencing the kind of freedom and peace that comes from living authentically. Thank you for being here, for listening to my story, for sharing this experience with me. And remember, you're not alone in this. There are so many of us who have walked this path or are walking it right now. And together, we're learning that we don't need permission to exist on our own terms. We just need the courage to stop asking for it.